The US and Canada are like an old married couple right now. Usually joined at the hip with a strong trading relationship, cooperation on intelligence, and an ice hockey rivalry. But today they're bickering in public and threatening divorce. These bedroom arguments have gotten very spicy in recent months, with US President Trump calling for Canada to become the 51st state of the Union, an action that, if attempted, would no doubt lead to war. And that got us thinking. What if that actually happens? What if tomorrow Trump hit the red button and war broke out between the US and Canada? Where would the fighting happen? What tactics would both sides utilize? And who would win in the end? Will it be a case of warm apple pie in Ottawa, or revenge served ice cold and drizzled with maple syrup? And look, quick disclaimer today, we're gaming out a US-Canada war scenario, from where they might fight to how, and the key strengths and weaknesses of both sides. And in this scenario, the United States is the aggressor. The reason we've done this is to reflect the most realistic scenario in the current political climate. President Trump has mentioned on numerous occasions about taking the other country's territory by force, and also has said about wanting to make Canada the 51st state. That makes Uncle Sam the aggressor, I'm afraid. But don't worry about it too much, as this is mostly just for fun as the deaths of thousands of people could be. Anyway, whilst some ugly things have been said straining relations lately, the two nations are not on the brink of war. We can't speak for future events, though. We're good, we're just not that good. We're working on it. And finally, we're making this a 1 versus 1. There's no way to truly account for nations coming to Canada's aid. They might receive support or even covert arms from allies, but let's assume that this is the US versus Canada and not the US versus Canada and all of its friends. Do you ever feel like you're reading 5 different versions of the same headline and then you're still not really sure what actually happens? I mean, take this one for example. Trump and Saudi Arabia announced a $600 billion investment deal. I mean, some US outlets emphasize the $142 billion in defense spending, framing it as a military alliance. Meanwhile, international headlines highlighted the broader economic ties, downplaying the arms angle entirely. One headline warns of escalating tensions, another calls it a strategic partnership. Same story, somehow totally different narratives. Well, ground news doesn't just show you both sides, it shows you the blind spots. The blind spot feed highlights stories heavily covered on one side of the political spectrum, but just ignored by the other. You'll see not what's being said, but what's being missed. It's like news, but with peripheral vision. And every article comes with a bias rating and ownership data, so you know who's behind the story and how they lean politically. So, all you need to do is go to ground.news/warfronts and you'll get 40% off unlimited access with the Vantage plan. See how global events are framed locally, save the stories that matter, and stop reading in the dark. Thank you to Ground News for sponsoring, and now back to today's episode. Outgunned, Outmanned, Outnumbered, Outplanned. Now look, we're considering this to be a traditional modern conflict with all the bells and whistles, guns, bombs, missiles, aircraft, drones and tanks, certainly, but also economic implications, propaganda, logistics, energy and supply chains. All that sexy stuff. But there's a lot to cover here, so let's start with some numbers. The US military budget in 2024 was just shy of $1 trillion, with a T. Meanwhile, Canada's defense budget is actually in the process of being reduced by up to $900 million by 2026. Overall, their budget was around $34.6 billion in 2024. Now look, that is a lot of money, but it's around 30 times less than what America is spending. In terms of troop numbers, this comparison does not get easier to swallow for Canadians. Canada has around 60,000 readily available troops across its armed forces. Including reserves, that number creeps up to around 100,000. But the military is still considered to be understaffed. To make the understatement of the millennium, Washington, D.C. does not have that problem, with around 450,000 armed forces members. But this number, if all reservists and National Guard were called up, could expand to over 1 million. So Canada is outnumbered and would likely need heavy conscription campaigns to raise hundreds of thousands of extra troops who just won't be that well trained. It's also hopelessly outgunned. Canada has 74 main battle tanks, while the US has, wait for it, 9,100 of them. The Royal Canadian Air Force has around 400 very outdated aircraft, while the US has over 5,000 top-of-the-line airframes. That's without even mentioning the US Navy. It ain't close. You get the idea. For everything the Canadians have, the US has about 100 times more. Now, we could compare numbers all day, but we just wanted you to have an idea of the force imbalance that we're looking at here. It's absolutely enormous. So, where would all that equipment even be sent? The US-Canadian border is the longest in the world. That's a lot of choice for where to attack and not enough resources to defend everything at once. So, where would the most important theaters of this war be fought? Alright, so if a war between the US and Canada kicked off tomorrow, where across that almost 9,000 kilometer border would we likely see the most fighting? Now, a lot of fighting could be on the border itself, and we know this is the heavy-hitting analysis that you come for, but this actually does matter quite a lot for the potential conflict here. Across the south of Canada, the more temperate climate closer to the border means that most people, infrastructure, and cities live within about 100 kilometers of it, including the national capital of Ottawa. Across the border, you would expect to see skirmishes where military advantages can be pressed. For example, the waterways of Lake Michigan, Superior, Huron, and the St. Lawrence River all provide natural boundaries from which the Canadians can attempt to defend their land. And with the border so close to the capital, as well as the strategically significant cities of Montreal, Toronto, and Quebec, you would expect a lot of fighting in this pretty populated zone. If the US can capture Ottawa quickly, they would potentially be able to end the war before it even started. Meanwhile, a general push from the US would also likely seek to capture other infrastructure further west. The second area is on the border with Alaska, which neighbors Canada's Yukon region. Whilst far from sparsely populated, the border is long and provides a strategic squeezing point for the US to potentially encircle the Canadians from the north. The terrain here is a killer, and the fighting would be slow but potentially important. The third region to see fighting would be Canada's Arctic territories, where gaining a grip over the resources and access to the wider ocean is invaluable. Fighting here would be more about both sides trying to deprive the enemy of potential defensive resources and trade routes. Finally, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans would also see their fair share of conflict. The US Navy will want to place its ships in areas to harass Canadian forces and bomb key installations whilst also suppressing their boats. The Canadians may try to get out to sea on both sides, but whether they do or not may be down to operational readiness and speed, with coastal defenses being a key feature. Alright, so that's the where of this conflict. So here's another question. Countries don't go to war for no reason. So if the US and Canada did start a conflict, what are they fighting over? Well, it's the same reasoning used for the majority of wars throughout human history. Good old-fashioned expansionism and resources. Canada's a land with a lot of resources, many of which it supplies to the USA as part of their trading relationship. Precious metals like gold and silver are always useful, and Canada has a ton of both. They also have metals like uranium, lithium, aluminium, iron, nickel, cobalt, platinum, and zinc, as well as valuable rare earth metals. Energy resources would also be vital, as Canada supplies over half of US oil and a lot of its gas. So capturing that infrastructure is a day one objective. Canada also has a lot of lumber, potash, oil sands, and maple syrup, all extremely lucrative resources in the right hands. There's important infrastructure for all of it and more still, including diamonds, freshwater, coal mines, steel mills, and various refineries. The US would like to capture any and all of these resources across the nation to continue to enrich itself and make up for the drop in trade. So, where the US attacked would depend on which resources Washington sought to prioritize. Laurie Adkin, Professor Emerita at the University of Alberta, concurred with what Trump might be interested in capturing, quoting them, "There's a whole list of things here we could start to think about as being of interest to Trump, including the rare earth minerals that Trudeau mentioned, but also water, and he's actually mentioned that before. At some point, it will be land and food." David versus Goliath, Canada's combat strengths. So we know the why, the what, and the where, but how about the how? How could the US and Canada fight a war against each other, and what tactics would they use? Now, the breakout of war, assuming that everyone is prepared for it, both the US and Canada would seek out very different strategies. Assuming the US is the aggressor, it would seek to use combined arms warfare to cause shock and awe. The goal would be to take key cities, airports, resources, anti-air installations, and military choke points to defeat Canada before they even get a chance to react. This would be done through overwhelming air superiority combined with a coordinated ground invasion into Canada's interior. Ports, pipelines, and key roads would also be significant in minimizing Canada's chances to trade or turn off the oil and gas pipelines that flow down into the United States. They would need to also pacify the Canadian Navy and their bases in places like Saanich, Halifax, and Montreal, sinking ships and submarines wherever they can to leave its shores defenseless. They'd also need to ensure key communication lines were either severed or commandeered, as well as establishing an intelligence HQ and seizing radar stations that would help the US tap into Canadian logistic chains. Canada's goal? That's simple. Survival. The government would likely need to find safe refuge either within the nation or elsewhere in the world in exile. And with the US border just 73.5 kilometers from the Canadian capital of Ottawa, it's fair to say having a plan B might be beneficial. In general, the strategy for Canada would be to turn their country into a living, breathing weapon. Canada would need to use the vast geography and differing landscapes to suffocate and demoralize American forces at every opportunity. The heavy use of asymmetric weapons, such as drones and manpads, would be an absolute necessity to try and quell US air power, and underground tunnels would become essential to avoid targeting and keeping logistics flowing. The Canadians would likely need to wage a guerrilla war from further into the nation's interior, as defending all the border cities, including the capital, is simply impossible against the might of Uncle Sam. Meanwhile, key efforts would need to be made to attack the logistical base of the behemoth that is the US military. After all, the tip of a spear can't thrust forward without a robust handle behind it. One would expect Canada to target fuel depots and supply trucks, sabotage pipelines, assassinate major military figures, disrupt communications, and use the terrain to their advantage to bleed the US forces dry at every step. Alright, so those would likely be the general goals and how both militaries would aim to complete them. But how do you apply this context to both nations' strengths and weaknesses? When fighting on the ground, how could both militaries try and exploit gaps to turn the tide in their favor? Well, let's start with those lumberjack-looking, polite society enjoying, not real bacon-eating Canadians, shall we? What key strengths in a full-on war with the United States could Canada use to its advantage? Now, the first is the terrain. As we've established, with the US being the larger force and with a president actively advocating to drag Ottawa into the Union kicking and screaming, it would likely be the aggressor. With their overwhelming numbers, US forces would find themselves in the Canadian interior. Now, Canadian geography is both vast and varied, and not only are Ottawa's forces well equipped to handle the different environments in which they train and live, they also have home field advantage in knowing the best and most defensible areas, including local context a foreign soldier reading a map simply cannot get. As a result, the smaller Canadian forces would likely be able to maneuver around the battlefield quicker than the large and lumbering US military. The addition of tunnels and subterranean warfare also real important here. That variance is also a problem. Near the border, you have densely built-up cities and population centers. When every building is a staging ground for a potential ambush, the Americans will have no choice than to either bomb the cities flat, destroying valuable infrastructure they could use and causing massive optics problems, or else to clear the way house by house, street by street, sustaining casualties every step of the way against an equipped and dug-in opposition in strategic choke points. It's like Iraq, just colder. Get beyond that, and the eastern half of the country is covered by what is known as the Canadian Shield, an expansive network of lands made from ancient rock, thin soil, forests, lakes, swamps, peaks, and valleys. This is incredibly difficult terrain to fight in, giving the Canadians even more of an advantage. US mechanized units would bog down here, meaning the US would need to rely heavily on air power to pacify almost half the nation, and troops on the ground would be slow, with the Canadians fighting tooth and nail for every blade of grass, which would sap morale, personnel, and resources. Head out to the west, and it's even worse. First, you hit the Central Prairies, which, whilst good for offensives and taking ground quickly, are massively open with long lines of visibility, meaning drones and artillery here would be a nightmare. Further west, you have the extension of the US's own Rocky Mountains, the highest peaks of which are well over 3,000 meters up. Mountains give the defenders a visibility and range advantage, and they are extremely useful for digging in and being stubborn, which is a Canadian national sport. The US struggled enough in Kandahar for similar reasons against the Taliban, and the Canadian military is bigger, more disciplined, and better equipped. Go north and you hit the Arctic territories, which will be its own special brand of miserable to fight in. Everywhere you look, the terrain is Canada's closest ally. And it's not like the Canadians are a ragtag group of rebels holed up in the mountains with no resources. Canadian troops are well-trained, very well-disciplined, and traditionally have high morale, with the rally around the flag effect in a national conflict for survival making this even more so. Canada also has elite special forces units that will be near peers for the US's own in terms of training and ability. The rest of the army has modern equipment, and they're organized, efficient planners who know the terrain and know their enemy. In terms of the personnel they will be fighting against, the Canadians would be the US's toughest fight since Vietnam. There are also total warfare implications here too. Due to a homogenous language, some Canadians and Americans can be hard to tell apart by things like accent alone, depending on where someone is from. There will be many potential saboteurs and spies Canada could send to infiltrate the United States. Some might already even be in the country when the war breaks out. This could lead to advances in military intelligence, it could cause problems with US logistical operations, equipment could be sabotaged, bridges blown up, just the sort of thing that will wreak havoc behind enemy lines and slow the Americans down. And the reality is, with an enemy that can blend in so seamlessly, the line between combatant and non-combatant becomes blurry. It's not just Canadians in America that Ottawa can take advantage of, but also Americans themselves. There are 2 centuries of history between the two nations. They have a common language, culture, and colonial history. There are many families that span the border. It's a logical assumption to think that some Americans won't be happy about such an invasion and might even try to undermine it. In March of this year, Colorado Governor Jared Polis responded to Trump's threats by saying, quote, "There is a lot of love and support from the people of the United States for our friends and allies in Canada. And just as in Canada, many folks are dismayed by the words of our president." And that's as far south as Colorado, let alone right in the border towns. And because the US is the aggressor here, Canada can also win the battle for hearts and minds as the plucky underdog, further lowering US morale. Canada may well win the propaganda war that would ensue. Even with American-backed news media, places like Europe would largely take Canada's side, although this would be unlikely to lead to any proper material support. Squashed like a bug, the US counterstrategy. So, those are the advantages the Canadians can bring to bear. Now we touch on the Canadian weaknesses, and as far as fighting the US military goes, there's an awful lot of them. Think of this as something of a list of US-based strengths as well, because there's definitely a lot of overlap here. For starters, the first stage of this war is likely to be real quick. As mentioned, there's a lot of important infrastructure close to the border. For example, Highway 17 connects the east and west of the country, roughly in the center near Winnipeg. And in some areas, it's the only thing connecting both halves of the nation by road. The Americans would be smart to seize this highway in the initial invasion, cutting the entire country in half and causing havoc for Canadian logistics. There are 3 potential solutions for the Canadian forces. Solution 1 is targeting troop stations in the area to hopefully clear the road, but you're risking driving soft supply trucks directly into a US fortified position, and that ain't gonna end well. Solution 2 is to go through the lakes and wetlands to the south, but this will likely be in view of the Americans and the border itself, and good luck getting any supplies over all that water. The last option is to drive into the United States itself and circumnavigate the choke points using American roads. But if you thought the border was strict during peacetime, wait until you see it during war. And that's just one example. Canada also, remember, is kind of surrounded. I mean, sure, it's got ocean to its east and the Arctic territories to the north, but the US Navy is also in those seas, and American planes fly over Arctic airspace all the time as part of NORAD. And of course, to the northwest is Alaska, which is only a hop, skip, and a jump on the sea from Vancouver Island or the Arctic territories, and provides another large border that Canada cannot defend with its inferior numbers. So, it's pretty isolated. Even if another country wanted to help, they're not getting through the net very easily. Sea routes for trade will be cut off from the outside, and Canada's own navy likely won't even get out of port. And of course, Canada's main weakness is that it is massively outgunned and outmanned with strength ratios of 10 to 1, and that's just the armies, let alone the rest of the forces. Modern military doctrine dictates that to overwhelm a dug-in enemy, you need 3 to 1 troop advantage to dislodge them, and the US could likely provide that in spades. Any extra soldiers Canada pieces together will likely be conscripts who have never fired a gun in their lives, and they are outnumbered by the world's strongest military. Throw in the fact that Canada is also massively outnumbered in terms of material like tanks and planes, that US intelligence is likely stronger than Canadian intel, and the fact that Canada has a limited air defense network, and it is not a brilliant prognosis for Canadian sovereignty. The US will also be able to wage combined arms warfare in a way that Canada never could. Drones, AC-130 gunships, F-35s, Apache helicopters, cyber attacks, economic and trade warfare, espionage, assassinations, you name it, Canada is going to be getting it from every angle. Oh yes, and speaking of Americans, what about those cheeseburger-eating, Amazon-shopping baseball lovers? What do their strengths and weaknesses look like in a war against Canada? Well, As mentioned, their strengths are overwhelming firepower, air superiority, technology, discipline, training, and organization. A well-kitted out fighting force of American battalions storming to the border might make the average Canadian feel like the Great White North was about to meet a great white shark. However, there are bound to be some exploitable weaknesses in America's potential invasion of its hat. And when you're on your own against the strongest fighting force history has ever witnessed, you're going to need every advantage you can muster. Whilst the US are used to fighting in different climates across the world and have specialized units specifically equipped to deal with the kind of terrain they would experience in Canada, the conditions do suit the Canadians better. They're just more used to it, and a lot of the US's best ground equipment can't travel easily in a lot of Canadian land. It could, in the right circumstances, mirror a modern version of the Winter War, in which Finland fought off overwhelming Soviet firepower with knowledge of the terrain and a familiarity with frozen conditions. The Soviets were no strangers to that kind of weather either, and yet the Finns, leaning into the environmental advantage, led to mass Soviet casualties. It could be the case for Canada too, but technology has come a long way since then, which may give the US innovative new ways to solve old Soviet problems. The danger in being a massive and occupying force is that you're a big target. So the US will be more vulnerable to asymmetric styles of warfare like in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. IEDs, a main staple in all those conflicts, accounting for large numbers of US casualties, will be important in Canada as well. Cyber attacks or attacks on US infrastructure will disproportionately affect the home front. And that home front is going to matter to an American population who have seen their military storm into several countries over the decades. They've seen the script before, get bogged down while their servicemen and women are slaughtered for years, only to pull out with nothing to show for it but a bunch of bodies, a country that hates them, and a mission accomplished banner. And this brings to light one of the US's biggest weaknesses: time. The home front is going to feel the war more acutely than any war the US has fought since World War II because it's right there on their doorstep. The pressure would likely mount as the international community decries US actions. Being seen as the aggressor would be an optics nightmare. Combine that with the potential of occupation fatigue and the hell that is guerrilla warfare against an opponent with near-peer training equipment and tech who knows US doctrine intimately, having fought together in the past, and the war would likely become unpopular very, very quickly. And this means that they would need to end it as soon as possible. The longer the Canadians can delay and to trick the Americans, the worse it becomes back home. And that is what could actually lead to Canadian survival. The average American may also acutely feel the economic effects of going to war with your biggest trading partner. Sure, Canada would be economically devastated by such a conflict, but Canada provides an awful lot of resources to the US. Whether it's natural resources like oil and gas through their many pipelines that feed the US, Canada is the US's #1 supplier of crude. But there's plenty more: agriculture and food products, fresh water from their many lakes, diamonds, and uranium. Canada even supplies a significant amount of hydroelectric power to US cities like New York. The US will simply not be able to pick up the slack on all sides when that goes away. It's also why it would be critical for the US to capture such resources to keep the lights on. The longer the Canadians hold out, the worse the economic bottleneck gets, and the potential massive logistical operation that is the US military could slow significantly, if not grind to a halt altogether. Now, this would only likely be a short-term issue, as the US would likely still be able to trade thanks to its huge navy. So, all it would need is a nation willing to sell Washington some critical goods until US production can rise to meet the level required. But that's not necessarily easy when you've just become a global pariah, and as we've established, time is crucial here. From a combat perspective, there could also be a concern of captured US equipment being used against their own forces. Even just guns, for example. There are so many guns in the US that smugglers would likely take the risk to move them over the border for a payday from Canadians on the other side. And there are a lot of guns to buy. Within a small time, every adult in Canada could be using the US's Second Amendment against it. Overall, however, these weaknesses are probably not enough to stop the US military from completing its objective in Canada. The US have a quality and quantity of troops and equipment that would simply become too much for the Canadians really quickly. But hey, people thought the same thing about Russia and Ukraine, and look how that went. However, it's also fair to say that the US military has very few of the massive dysfunctions that the Russian one did in February 2022. It all rests on that linchpin of time. If the Americans achieve their goals quickly, they win. If they don't, it's going to be another long, hard grind on foreign soil. But what are the major implications that fall out once the fighting begins? Because a US-Canada war wouldn't just affect North America, it'd affect the entire world. Global consequences. So, what would happen for global geopolitics as well as for the US and Canada if this war did happen? Well, the biggest result would likely be economic and could even lead to a restructuring of the international order as we know it. The US getting involved in full-scale war with real economic consequences to the fighting could cause the dollar to tank in value. Now, the US military-industrial complex could go into overdrive and keep the war economy stable, then children in schools would need to start pledging allegiances to Lockheed Martin, but across the board, it's likely that global trade would be down with the United States as nations would seek to punish Washington. And it doesn't matter how much you build if nobody's buying. Such economic turmoil could allow nations like China and Russia to rise into the gap as the stable hegemon for other parts of the world whilst the US is distracted. China and Russia have been trying to topple the hegemony of the US dollar for years, but a war with Canada could create the opportunity to do it. Nations that want to see the US weakened could overtly or covertly supply Canada as they continue to try and bleed the Americans dry, like the Chinese shipping arms through the Arctic, for example, as it would be in Beijing's interest to do so. Adding fuel to the fire would continue to weaken the US whilst its adversaries only got stronger. If not totally flipping the international order completely, war would likely continue the move the world has been making from a unipolar to a multipolar one. And that perspective in the international community is likely to really matter as other nations reel from the dollar's crash. Long term, for the US and Canada, however, things would be even worse. Both nations would have lost their most valuable ally and closest trading partner. The defensive solidarity of North America would be shattered, with NORAD left completely in tatters. Russia would likely gain prominence in the Arctic, whilst NATO fractured. However, as this would be an internal dispute between two NATO members, no nation would be required to come to Canada's aid with Article 5. And to be honest, not many nations are going to give more than moral support with the risk of the US military turning its tax dollars on them too. France have suggested the idea of sending French troops to Greenland in the wake of the US's ambitions to take the territory for themselves. Logic dictates that they could consider the same for a francophone nation like Canada. Even if it did not turn the tide of this hypothetical conflict, it could delay the US enough to turn the home front against the government. But it's a big risk to go to war with the US for the good of another country when you stand a good chance of getting wiped out, all just to delay a conflict that many might well prefer to end quickly. So, Canada itself would likely be occupied by a hostile force, and a guerrilla insurgency would probably follow as Canadians fought for liberation. In both nations, tourism and skilled labor would decrease, there would be a brain drain which would further hurt both economies' long-term prospects. Europe would, as a result, be forced to stand alone or find uncomfortable new allies. It's a pretty bleak outlook for the Western world and its allies if this war was to ever come to pass. Now, sure, on paper, the US military would likely win. People may chant, USA, USA from the rooftops as the American flag rises over Ottawa. But don't think that means the US won. Sure, in total military terms, victory might almost be assured, especially within a shorter time frame. But in the long run, the US would suffer a devastating strategic loss. With its allies in ruins, its economy a mess, its currency devalued, its people dead, its soldiers stuck in a dangerous insurgency, and its adversaries rising on the world stage, it's all looking rather bleak. So let this be a forewarning to what unchecked expansionist ambition can lead to. It's not all new golden ages and problems magically solved. It's just suffering, further embittered by selfish reasoning. Because if there were truly to be a war between the US and Canada, there would be no real winners. It was US President Abraham Lincoln who said the famous words, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And war in the West wouldn't just divide the house, it would completely knock it down. Thank you for watching.